So now that we've talked a little bit about prejudice, stereotypes, microaggressions, implicit bias, I'd like to talk more about this concept that we call racism. Racism, from a sociological perspective, is a very specific way of thinking about race and race relations. Racism specifically is the belief that one racial category is innately superior or inferior to another. And this could be culturally, socially, intellectually, etc. And that for that reason, that group is deserving of an inferior place, a subordinate place in society. Racism itself is a very serious concept for sociologists because we understand that what underlines racism is really this perpetual form of oppression, of domination of some groups over others that can be very difficult to resist and undo. Racism can include practices, beliefs, and relationships that work to reproduce a racial hierarchy and a social structure that yields privilege to some and discriminates against others. Oftentimes, I hear people use the term racism, and it can be used very loosely. Sometimes I think racism is used to describe someone who maybe is stereotyping someone, or maybe even being prejudiced, which we already talked about, is something that we all have a tendency to be at times. But racism is really a much deeper um, um, process, and it is a much more kind of difficult concept, I think, for people sometimes to grasp. But also, when we think about it, we really have to understand what is at the root of racism. And at the root of it is really a belief that some categories of racial grouping, ethnic groupings, are better than others. And therefore, our actions, our behaviors, our laws, our rules, our system, our institutions come to reflect that. The interesting thing is that sometimes that practice can then become so ingrained in a society that we no longer even see it at work. It starts to take on a life of its own. And that's what we call structural racism, which we'll talk about in a minute. When all of a sudden racism doesn't have to be blatant, it doesn't have to be someone saying something to you and to your face, calling you a name, but it can be the things that are happening in an invisible way that lead people to say, we know something's going on here. We know this is racially motivated, but why can't we pinpoint it? Why can't we see it? Why can't we fix it? So, for that reason, I want to make a distinction between interpersonal racism and structural racism. Interpersonal racism is also referred to as overt racism. It's the kind of racism that's really clear for us to see. It's when someone says or does something that is very clear in your face and makes it easy to see that this person views some groups as being inferior to others. It includes maltreatment that could be targeted towards individuals, racial or ethnic groups. It includes very outward biases towards certain groups. It can include acts of exclusion, stigmatizing groups, name calling, unfair treatment, threats, harassment, violence. All of these ways that we see acts of racism portrayed upon people in a very visible way. So when we talk about, all of the visible acts of racism that we saw during the Jim Crow pre-civil rights era, um, hangings, lynchings, for example. Even what we see now when we look at the Black Lives Matters movement, for example, and we see kind of outward um, forms of aggression being um, experienced by some groups far less than others. This has also been talked about as ways in which overt racism still exists, even though Black Lives Matter is also an example of structural racism, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But any of these examples that really show these kind of outward displays or acts of violence against some groups and that are perpetrated by other groups. Um, Makes it very clear that we're talking about interpersonal racism. Now, I want to distinguish that from structural racism. Structural racism is sometimes called institutional racism as well. And this is a form of racism that reflects the practices that become a part of our social and our political institutions. Structural racism is racism that's built into the operation of our social institutions, our criminal justice system, our employment and economic system, um, our housing market, our healthcare industry, our political institutions, our educational institutions. It is when racism or racial differences and disparities between groups become so apparent and so sustained over time that we have to say something about race is at play here. It's the same way as when we talked about gender and the wage gap. And we said we can look at all of these different things, but at some point we have to say, I think this has more to do with the discriminatory factor, the types of ways that we put gender differences and embed gender inequality into our institutions, that has to be something that's accounting for a part of the wage gap. Well, we would say the same is true for race. When we take away individual motivation and character and personality and motivation and all of these other things, and we still see educational disparities, we still see wealth disparities, we still see a racial wage gap, when all of these things still persist, when we still see more people of color in the criminal justice system than non-people of color, when we see that there are differences in how people are prosecuted for crimes based on the race of the group, then we start saying, when we see these things systematically over and over again, and they're no longer random, they're no longer individual occurrences, then we have to start talking about the persistence of structural racism. I wanted to give you some examples of structural racism, what I'm calling here systemic racism. That's another word that we use to refer to the way that race becomes a part of all of our social systems, and that it becomes very difficult uh, to 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 just make it go away because it's so ingrained and so embedded in our systems. And just briefly, I just want to present you with a few slides here that give you some examples. As we talked about in the pre-civil rights era, we had actual laws. So these were forms of structural or institutionalized racism that were actually built into the legal system and were justified through laws. A Plessy versus Ferguson, U.S. Supreme Court case that actually said separate but equal public facilities between African Americans and whites was legal. So the idea of different schools, different water fountains, uh, not being able to sit in the same areas of a bus or use the same restaurants, for example. Also, the grandfather clause in 1890 law that actually declared that newly freed blacks um, could vote, but only if they had a literate and registered voting grandfather. Um, Now, the problem with this is that most newly freed blacks did not have grandparents that were literate or that could vote. And so it becomes a perpetuating cycle for the most part that newly freed slaves will never really be able to vote based on this law that has a determination of their ability to vote being based on um, previous ancestors who we know were denied the right. So that's kind of a way that we see um, structural racism at work. But here we're looking at pre-civil rights area. Well, what about currently? How do we see um, systemic racism and structural racism at work? Here are a few other examples. We can look at the housing market, for example. A concept you may be aware of is redlining. Redlining is illegal but practiced. It is actually a practice that discourages home ownership in certain areas. For example, it may be a real estate agent that conveniently doesn't show African Americans homes in certain neighborhoods or areas or cities. Same way, not showing these homes to whites, for example, maybe in a predominantly black neighborhood, encouraging whites not to move into that neighborhood. Um, this is a very common practice, although it is highly frowned upon, discouraged, and I think it's illegal in many states. Redlining is also seen through denying or increasing the cost of services in some communities, and this could be um, through loans, charging a higher interest rate for loans given to certain groups versus others. There's been a lot of discriminatory lawsuits that have been done probably over the last 10 years since the Great Recession, when we actually saw that there was quite a bit of redlining in loans and in banking and insurance when issuing loans and insurance policies for homes to African Americans, Latinos, and whites. A lot of racial disparities in terms of who got higher rates and who got lower rates. Even when we think about the access to jobs and healthcare and even supermarkets that are available to residents in certain areas, but then we go to other areas and we see that there's no grocery store, or people have to travel 5 or 10 miles to find a grocery store, that there's few job opportunities, that there's inadequate healthcare or clinics or medical facilities. All of these are examples of the way systematic structural racism can work, that some groups are just denied opportunities just on the basis of race, where they live, the group that they are associated with. Residential segregation is also an example I have here. You can look over this slide. Residential segregation is also a big issue because we know that the concentration of, of groups by race, by income, is a big problem in the United States. It's not unlikely for us to drive through neighborhoods and to see neighborhoods with, really big houses, for example, beautiful neighborhoods, wonderful schools, but we know that certain groups and populations don't have access to those neighborhoods, largely because of income, but it also leads to a racial residential segregation where we tend to find low income people, people of color, concentrated in certain communities. Those communities also tend to have, as we just talked about from the previous slide, fewer resources, houses that are not worth as much, so a lower tax base to support the schools in the neighborhood. So all of these things begin to have a spiraling effect. Lastly, we can even talk about the justice system as an example of structural racism. In this slide, I'm just talking about how there's a large disparity in arrest in the US population for things such as drug offenses. The problem of why we call this structural racism is because when we look at how offenses are punished, we see racial disparities. Whites and blacks are often prosecuted differently for drug offenses, for example, possession versus sale. For possession of crack, which is a higher sentence than possession of powder cocaine, which tends to have a lower sentence. Crack has typically been associated with minority communities, crack cocaine with non minority communities. Um, so also, even when we talk about just general drug use in the population, we actually see that there's not very much difference between blacks and whites in terms of drug use. Both groups report about the same percentage of drug use, particularly marijuana use. Um, but we know that blacks are arrested, um, tried, and incarcerated at rates that are 2 to 3 times higher than those of whites. So these both give you examples of structural racism and how it is different from interpersonal racism, but also from prejudice or stereotypes.